He had not heard that ringtone in 3 years. It was a soft melody she once chose while laughing on a lazy Sunday afternoon, insisting their phones should sound like memories rather than alarms. After her passing, he considered deleting the number, yet his hand never managed to complete the task. The number remained in his contacts like a wound he refused to clean. It did not represent hope. It represented a guilt he carried like an invisible scar. It reminded him that some endings never truly finish. The night it happened was ordinary until that moment. He had fallen asleep in the living room, television humming in the background, a documentary he barely listened to playing softly. The house felt still, as if it were holding its breath. At 3 in the morning, the phone vibrated violently on the wooden table beside him. He opened his eyes expecting a wrong number or an emergency notification. Instead, he saw her name. The same profile picture stared back at him. Her eyes were warm. Her smile was real, frozen in time. His heart hammered in his chest. He sat upright, blinking several times, hoping fatigue would distort what he saw. It did not. The call continued ringing. He felt a strange pull, a mixture of disbelief and terror. Instinct pushed his thumb to accept the call before reason could intervene. He placed the phone to his ear. What followed was not silence. It was her voice, a voice he once heard every morning, a voice he believed was buried beneath layers of earth. It trembled, as if trembling from winter frost. She said she was cold. She asked him to open the door. He felt the air around him tighten. She had died in his arms. He still remembered the final moments of her life, the helplessness in her gaze, the sound of her last breath. He had stood at her funeral, surrounded by family, struggling not to collapse. He watched the coffin lower into the ground. He witnessed the soil cover her forever. He drove home that evening with a silence so deep it felt like another death. So how could she call him now? How did she know where he lived? He had moved away after the funeral. No one knew his new address unless he told them. She certainly did not. Before he could think further, he heard another sound. Slow knocks at the front door. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. A familiar rhythm. She used the same pattern when she forgot her keys and wanted him to laugh while letting her in. His hands began to shake. He stood up and took a step toward the hallway. The knocks continued with precise intervals, almost playful, yet filled with something colder than winter. He approached the door with caution. He forced himself to look through the peephole. His breath fogged the glass. Outside, the porch was empty. Wind rustled the trees. There was no shadow, no movement, yet the knocking persisted, as if coming from someone standing exactly where no one stood. The phone in his hand remained warm, the call still active, the silence on the other side no longer reassuring. He whispered her name, expecting static or error. Nothing answered. His mind searched for explanations. Perhaps a prank. Perhaps someone had cloned her number. The discomfort grew heavier because the knocks followed memories rather than logic. He felt drawn toward the handle, unable to resist the urge to open it. Curiosity mixed with dread. Each knock felt like a reminder that certain stories never end merely because one person is lowered into the ground. His fingers reached the lock. In that moment, he understood something chilling. Grief can rest. Regret cannot. And whatever waited behind that door did not belong to the past. It belonged to something unfinished that refused to stay buried. His hand trembled above the cold metal of the lock. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the winter wind screamed in a way that did not resemble weather. It sounded almost alive, as though something unseen prowled in the darkness, searching for a way inside. He leaned toward the peephole and squinted. The porch was empty. The path beyond was still. Yet the knocks continued, steady and intimate, as if guided by someone who knew the rhythm of his pulse. He hesitated. He felt the sensation of being observed. It was not the feeling of a stranger lurking. It was something more familiar, something that knew the layout of his fears. He turned quickly, convinced someone lingered behind him. Yet nothing moved. The silence was unnatural, almost rehearsed, as though the night itself was waiting for him to speak. He held the rose tightly. The petals quivered in the icy breeze, though his hand remained still. He returned inside and shut the door. The latch clicked, but the sound brought no comfort. The door creaked again, not from pressure, but as if pulled by an unseen force. The wood groaned like it did when she leaned on it while teasing him about forgetting his keys. He stepped back. The door opened a fraction without his touch. He pushed it closed again, harder this time, and secured it. Still, it trembled softly, rebelling against his decision. A chill crawled along his spine. He stared at the rose, unable to look away. It seemed more than a flower. It felt like an invitation. He placed it on the table and stepped back. The lights flickered. Something unseen passed through the room, shifting the air with intention. He whispered into the silence, asking who was there. His question remained unanswered, but the atmosphere changed. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by something that remembered him. The door stood still now, yet it no longer represented protection. It had become a threshold. Something waited beyond it, patient and persistent. The night held a secret, and he understood that whatever knocked was not finished. The boundary between past and present had moved, and he was standing exactly where it broke. His hand trembled above the cold metal of the lock. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the winter wind screamed in a way that did not resemble weather. It sounded almost alive, as though something unseen prowled in the darkness, searching for a way inside. He leaned toward the peephole and squinted. The porch was empty. The path beyond was still. Yet the knocks continued, steady and intimate, as if guided by someone who knew the rhythm of his pulse. He hesitated. His memory raced, replaying moments long buried. She used to knock in the same manner when she arrived late from work. It was their playful secret, a code that belonged only to them. Hearing that pattern again felt like a shard of the past forcing itself into the present. He tried to convince himself it was imagination, or perhaps a distant echo of nostalgia. Logic, however, struggled against the undeniable sound filling the hallway. Each knock felt closer than the last. He swallowed hard and turned the lock. The clicking sound echoed through the silent corridor. He opened the door with a cautious pull, bracing himself for a prankster or an intruder. The space before him was deserted. The porch light flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. His eyes dropped to the ground. A single white rose lay upon the doormat. It was fresh, its petals untouched by frost, as though someone had placed it there moments before he arrived. His heart tightened. White roses had once been her obsession. She believed they carried messages the living rarely understood. He had placed countless white roses on her grave each year since her passing. Seeing one at his door felt like a conversation neither of them had finished. He reached down and picked it up. Its stem was wet, like something recently pulled from a place where light never reached. The scent awakened memories he fought to suppress. He scanned the ground again and noticed a footprint embedded in the frost. It was small, delicate, and unmistakably feminine. The print led toward the garden path, then ended abruptly as if the person creating it had dissolved into the air. He stepped outside and followed the direction of the impression. The cold air stung his face. The wind hissed through the branches, creating a strange melody that bordered on speech. His breath fogged into the night, and each exhale felt heavier than the last. He felt the sensation of being observed. It was not the feeling of a stranger lurking. It was something more familiar, something that knew the layout of his fears. He turned quickly, convinced someone lingered behind him. Yet nothing moved. The silence was unnatural, almost rehearsed, as though the night itself was waiting for him to speak. He held a rose tightly. The petals quivered in the icy breeze, though his hand remained still. He returned inside and shut the door. The latch clicked, but the sound brought no comfort. The door creaked again, not from pressure, but as if pulled by an unseen force. The wood groaned like it did when she leaned on it while teasing him about forgetting his keys. He stepped back. The door opened a fraction without his touch. He pushed it closed again, harder this time, and secured it. Still, it trembled softly, rebelling against his decision. A chill crawled along his spine. He stared at the rose, unable to look away. It seemed more than a flower. It felt like an invitation. He placed it on the table and stepped back. The lights flickered. Something unseen passed through the room, shifting the air with intention. He whispered into the silence, asking who was there. His question remained unanswered, but the atmosphere changed. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by something that remembered him. The door stood still now, yet it no longer represented protection. It had become a threshold. Something waited beyond it, patient and persistent. The night held a secret, and he understood that whatever knocked was not finished. The boundary between past and present had moved, and he was standing exactly where it broke. He picked up the phone with hands that refused to stay steady. The device felt heavier than usual, as though it carried something it was never meant to hold. The screen glowed with a notification that made his stomach tighten. A new voicemail waited for him. It was from her number, the same contact he had refused to delete. His heart pounded as he opened the message. Time seemed to bend around him as he pressed play. The living room darkened, and even the walls appeared to shrink in anticipation. Her voice filled the room. It was not distorted or faint. It was clear, calm, and painfully familiar. The sound of it tore open memories he had tried to lock away. She spoke as if she were standing beside him, as if not a single day had passed since their last conversation. She mentioned the argument they never resolved. He remembered that night clearly. It was the final time they had raised their voices at each other. Words were exchanged that neither of them believed but could not take back. She referenced the exact phrases he had uttered, phrases he had never repeated to anyone. Hearing them again shattered him. The voicemail continued. She spoke of the promise he made and failed to keep. He felt his breath falter. The promise involved something sacred to her, something she held close to her heart. He had promised to finish a project she started, a project that held emotional weight. He had abandoned it after her death, unable to confront the pain it carried. No one else knew about that promise. Not friends, not family. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if it were closing in around him. Her tone changed near the midpoint of the recording. There was a shift, like breath turning into frost. The warmth he once loved became distant, cold, and unsettling. She spoke of the secret he hid at her funeral. He flinched. The memory he had buried surfaced without mercy. At the funeral, he had whispered something to her coffin that no one heard. He had asked for forgiveness for something he never dared to admit aloud. Hearing her mention, it made him question the boundary between the living and the dead. His pulse hammered against his ribs. The voicemail drew towards silence before a final message emerged. Her voice held no anger, only certainty. She told him he should not have moved on without telling her. The sentence pierced him. There was a name in her words. The name of the woman he had recently begun seeing. He whispered it aloud just to confirm he was not imagining things. His skin crawled. He had never spoken that name in his home. He had never saved it in his contacts. He had told no one about this new relationship. Hearing the name from a number that belonged to someone buried in the ground made his knees feel weak. He replayed the voicemail several times, searching for glitches or signs of fabrication. There were none. Every sound was authentic. Every detail was accurate. The recording ended in a faint exhale, like someone preparing to speak again but deciding to wait. He stared at the phone, unwilling to touch it, as if the device might continue speaking without permission. The silence that followed felt unnatural. It pulsed with intention, like a presence observing him. He walked to the window and scanned the yard. The night looked ordinary, yet he sensed something watching from beyond the glass. The voicemail felt like a confrontation rather than a memory. Something wanted acknowledgement. Something wanted answers. The past had not visited him. It had pursued him. The phone remained on the table, glowing faintly, waiting for him to return. He realized that whatever had reached out to him was not a message. It was an invitation, and he no longer knew if he wanted to hear the next part. He left his house before the sun appeared, unable to bear another moment inside walls that felt as if they had begun to breathe. The phone, the rose, the footprints, and a voicemail formed a chain he could no longer ignore. His thoughts moved faster than the car. The roads were empty. The streetlights flickered like tired watchmen, and each turn toward the cemetery felt heavier than the last. He had not visited her resting place in months, not because he forgot, but because standing beside that stone always felt like reopening a wound stitched with regret. The iron gates of the cemetery squealed as he pushed them open. A thick fog hugged the ground, muffling sound and distance. His shoes crunched against gravel, echoing in a space that felt abandoned by time. The trees stood motionless, yet seemed to lean toward him, their branches resembling arms stretched in warning. He followed the familiar path toward her grave, every step pushing him deeper into the cold silence. When he reached the spot, he stopped breathing for a moment. Something was wrong. Her tombstone leaned forward, no longer upright as he remembered. It appeared as if someone had pressed from within, trying to force it aside. His hands trembled as he approached. The soil in front of the stone was loose and dark. It had been shifted recently. The ground was soft, not hardened by winter frost. He knelt and touched the earth. It was damp, as though disturbed during the night, as though something had moved beneath it. He stood and surveyed the surroundings. A faint trail of white petals lay scattered across the grass. At first, he thought they had blown from a wreath, but these petals were fresh and unblemished. He remembered leaving a bouquet of white roses on her grave the last time he visited. He had not expected them to last more than a week. Yet here were petals as if newly placed. The petals formed a narrow line leading away from the grave. He followed them, his heart thudding against his ribs. The trail led him across the cemetery, past rows of stones and silent witnesses. His breath fogged the air, and the scent of soil mixed with a subtle floral aroma, faint and unsettling. The petals stopped at a precise point near the exit. He recognized the location instantly. That was where he had parked his car the last time he visited. It was also the place where he had stood alone while whispering to her coffin, believing his words would remain sealed in silence forever. He turned back toward the tombstone and noticed something else he had missed. A message had been scratched onto the stone. The letters were uneven and jagged, as if carved by trembling fingers. He stepped closer to read it. The words formed a short sentence that drained warmth from his body. It read, "I am not resting. You know why?" The statement felt like a finger pointing directly at him. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. The message was not an accusation. It was a reminder. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of it. He considered the possibility of vandalism, but the intimacy of the message felt personal. No stranger could have known the weight those words carried. The inscription reflected their history, her fears, and his failures. He pressed his palm against the stone, expecting cold granite. Instead, the surface felt strangely warm, as if touched recently by something alive. A distant bell tolled from the chapel near the cemetery entrance. The sound reverberated through the fog, shaking the stillness. He stepped back from the grave, unable to remain in that space any longer. The air felt heavy, thick with memory and expectation. As he walked away, the petals seemed to brighten under the dim sky, marking a path that did not feel random. It felt directed. He reached his car with a heart burdened by more questions than answers. The message on the stone echoed inside him. He understood one thing clearly. Whatever was unfolding did not originate from the present. It came from a decision made long before she died. The past had awakened, and it was not finished. Clara found him standing motionless in the kitchen. He had returned from a cemetery at dawn, clothes still damp from fog and breath trembling with a weight he could not name. She watched him with concern, expecting ordinary explanations. He offered none. His silence filled the room like smoke. She tried to lighten the air with humor, mentioning ghosts and restless spirits, believing the idea ridiculous enough to chase away tension. The joke landed flat. His expression remained frozen, eyes fixed on the counter behind her. Clara turned to see what held his gaze. A single white rose rested near the fruit bowl. Its petals appeared untouched by time, as if placed moments before she entered the room. She reached for it, expecting the softness of a fresh bloom. The scent that met her was strange, not sweet or fragrant, but something deeper, as though carrying the memory of damp soil. She withdrew her hand quickly. It was the same type of rose she had seen in a photograph of his wife's grave. She remembered him mentioning how difficult it was to find this particular variety. The nearest florist who carried them was several towns away. Her smile faded. She searched his face for an explanation. He offered none. A chill moved through her chest as a sudden thought took shape. She stepped back and placed both hands on the counter, steadying herself. She asked if he had gone out during the night. He shook his head. The rose was not there when they went to sleep. One of them would have noticed it. It was impossible for anyone to enter the house without waking the alarm system. She checked her phone instinctively, as if expecting a message to justify the unease twisting inside her. Her expression shifted from worry to something tighter, something close to fear. She confessed there was something she had not told him. She had received calls over the past 2 weeks from an unknown number. She had ignored them at first, believing they were ordinary mistakes. The voice on the other end left messages. Clara played one of them for him. He froze as he listened. The voice was faint but clear enough to carry intent. It spoke his name. It mentioned words he had once whispered to his wife during a private moment before her final night in the hospital. Clara watched him turn pale as he realized the voice described emotions he had never shared with anyone. She explained the caller had warned her not to stay with him. The messages begged her to leave while she still could. The voice spoke of the house and described rooms Clara had never shown anyone. It mentioned the pattern of his sleep, the way he paced when troubled, and the way he held his breath when remembering something painful. Clara swore she had no explanation. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had begun to dread nighttime. Every ring felt like someone tapping on the door of her thoughts, trying to step inside. He sank onto a chair, shoulders bowed as if the air itself had gained weight. The past was no longer content being a memory. It was becoming a presence. Clara approached him carefully. She asked whether anyone else knew intimate details of his former marriage. He shook his head. He had shared nothing, not even with her. She continued speaking, her voice almost a whisper. She asked who could know the color of his late wife's favorite dress, the poem she wrote for their anniversary, or the private nickname only the two of them understood. The final question emerged slowly, as if afraid of its own existence. Clara asked him who was trying to return. The words rang through the room, lingering like smoke that refused to clear. He looked at her with eyes that no longer sought comfort. Something inside him shifted. The rose was not a coincidence. The calls were not accidents. A boundary had been crossed. The past was reaching out, and its intentions were no longer hidden. He realized he was no longer dealing with memories. He was dealing with someone who believed their story was not finished. And whoever that someone was, they did not plan to let him move forward without them. He spent the afternoon in the attic, searching for answers in dusty boxes that had not been opened since he moved into the house. Clara stayed downstairs, pacing from room to room, unable to silence the unease that had taken root. He lifted old albums, each one heavier than its weight suggested. His hands trembled as he opened the covers. Photographs spilled out like fragments of a life he thought he understood. He sat on the floor and flipped through pages filled with anniversaries, vacations, and moments that once felt eternal. Yet none of the images explained the calls, the rose, or the message on the grave. He was about to close the third album when something caught his eye. A photo that did not belong among familiar scenes was wedged between the pages. He pulled out carefully. The image froze his breath. His late wife stood beside another woman he did not recognize. They were smiling, their expressions bright, as if sharing a secret. Both wore necklaces with a peculiar key-shaped pendant. He stared at the picture, then at the date printed on the bottom. It had been taken months before he met Clara. His heart jolted. He did not remember seeing this woman at the funeral, or in his memories, or in any stories his wife had shared. He looked more closely at the second woman. Something about her face tugged at recognition. Her smile resembled Clara's when she first entered his life, before fear began chasing her sleep. He set the album aside and hurried downstairs, gripping the photograph. Clara turned toward him, startled by his expression. He placed the picture on the table between them. Her eyes widened as she stared at the faces. She covered her mouth and stepped back, confusion drowning her features. The second woman was her mother. Her hand shook. She whispered that she had not seen that photograph before. She said her mother never mentioned knowing his wife. He struggled to form words. He pointed to the necklaces in the picture. Clara touched the pendant resting against her chest, the very same design she always wore. She had received it from her mother when she was a child. She believed it was a family keepsake with no hidden meaning. Seeing it replicated on the neck of a woman buried under the earth made her knees weaken. The object now felt like a link in a chain neither of them understood. He asked Clara if her mother had ever visited his previous home, attended gatherings, or crossed paths with his wife. Clara shook her head repeatedly. Her mother had lived overseas for years before moving back to the city. She insisted there was no opportunity for them to have met. Yet the image testified otherwise. He tried to remember if his wife had ever spoken about someone who influenced her choices or shared unusual ideas about keys and locks. He recalled vague moments when she mentioned symbolism, secrets, and the belief that every person held a key to someone else's destiny. He had dismissed those conversations as poetic quirks. Clara took the photograph and studied her mother's posture. She noticed how the two women leaned toward each other, not as strangers, but as if bonded by something more profound than coincidence. Clara's lips trembled as she asked if his wife ever collected keys or believed in hidden meanings. He remembered scenes from their early relationship, where his wife kept small boxes sealed with intricate locks. He never asked what was inside. She would laugh and say the answer would reveal itself when the time was right. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them. Clara wondered if her mother had been connected to his life long before he ever met her. The idea unsettled him. It suggested a design he had never noticed, a silent thread weaving their lives together before they understood the pattern. He paced the room, unwilling to accept randomness. Clara clutched her necklace, as if afraid it might change shape. The air thickened with the realization that something had been set in motion long before they were aware of it. The photograph was no longer a memory. It had become evidence. Evidence that the past was not merely returning. It had been waiting, and whatever linked those women had begun unraveling the moment Clara stepped into his life. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten intentions. He climbed the creaking steps once more, compelled by the growing suspicion that the past was no longer resting where he had left it. The air felt different this time, as though someone had been there recently. Boxes that once seemed randomly stacked appeared rearranged, as if guiding him toward a specific destination. He opened one container, then another, searching for anything that could explain the photograph of his wife and Clara's mother. His hand brushed against a folder wedged behind an old suitcase. His name was not written on it, yet the paper felt familiar beneath his fingertips, as though it recognized him before he even opened it. Inside were rental agreements. They looked worn but intact. His breath caught as he read the details. The address was his house. Only the dates did not match his memory. The agreements were signed years before he and his wife had ever decided to move in together. He flipped through pages, expecting clerical error or misunderstanding. Instead, he found her signature. Her name appeared boldly at the bottom of each sheet. She had rented the house long before they met. The realization crawled into him like ice. He tried to recall every conversation they had about finding a place to live. She had insisted the house felt right, but he never questioned why. He had assumed it was intuition, not knowledge. He sat on an old trunk, the weight of the documents pressing against his chest. The attic seemed to tilt, walls closing in as his understanding of his marriage fractured. He wondered why she never mentioned knowing the house beforehand. He wondered what had drawn her here. He could not accept that it was coincidence. The walls that surrounded him now felt like witnesses who had held their tongues for too long. He gathered the papers and descended the stairs, each step echoing with the eerie sensation that his wife had orchestrated a path he had simply followed. Later that afternoon, he drove to the landlord's office. The building was old, with cracked tiles and lights that flickered without reason. He entered and asked to speak with the owner. The landlord, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a voice that held more stories than time allowed, listened in silence as he presented the documents. The man nodded slowly, as though expecting the visit. He confirmed that his wife had indeed signed the agreements. She had toured the property alone, asked questions no ordinary tenant would ask, and insisted that the house was the only place that felt correct. The landlord recalled a peculiar statement she made during their final meeting. She had said the house was where everything would end. At the time, he thought she was speaking metaphorically. He never imagined she meant something literal. The words struck him now with chilling clarity. His wife had known the house before she met him. She had chosen it with intent. He asked the landlord if she had given any explanation. The man shook his head, though his eyes reflected something he could not articulate. He told him she left shortly after signing the papers, and no one else ever inquired about them until now. Driving home, he felt as if he were entering a place he no longer recognized. The doors, floors, and windows were unchanged, yet every detail carried new meaning. The house was no longer shelter. It was a stage. He walked from room to room, noticing things he once ignored. There were locks on closets he never used and a strange alcove behind the bedroom wall he had never explored. Every corner felt arranged, not accidental. The documents told a truth he had never considered. He had not discovered this house. He had been led to it. His wife had prepared it before she became his wife. She had selected it before he understood her intentions. He realized then that the house may not have been meant for their life together. It may have been meant for something that followed her death. He stood in the silent hallway, sensing a presence that waited for acknowledgement. The house was not his beginning. It was her unfinished ending, and he had moved into a plan he never knew existed. He returned to the attic that evening with the intention of understanding what else his wife left concealed. The house no longer felt like shelter. It resembled a vault, filled not with possessions, but with intentions he had never questioned. The dust swirled under the weak light bulb as he searched for an object he could not name. He pushed aside old coats and books, certain something waited for him. A wooden box appeared at the back of a shelf, sealed with a small metal clasp. His pulse raced as he pulled it free. The surface was scratched, as though someone had attempted to open it before. Inside his chest, his heartbeat felt like a hammer striking stone. He carried the box downstairs and examined it closely. The lock was not complicated. He inserted a thin piece of metal and twisted gently. The clasp snapped open with a soft click, releasing the scent of aged paper and faded perfume. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of letters, photographs, and an item that made his throat tighten. It was her diary. He recognized the cover immediately. She used to scribble thoughts inside it during quiet evenings, never allowing him to read a single page. She claimed it was for her eyes alone, yet now it waited for him, as though time had preserved its contents for exactly this moment. He opened to the first page. Her handwriting curled across the paper with a confidence he remembered well. She wrote of simple days and tender moments, descriptions of their early life, and hopes she once held close. These entries soothed him briefly, like a lullaby sung to a restless child. He turned the pages slowly, moving deeper into their shared history. The softness dissolved. The tone shifted. Her words grew heavier. She wrote about trust in fragile shapes, describing how love can collapse when shadows form behind smiles. One entry forced him to sit down. The ink seemed darker, pressed into the page as if carved rather than written. It was dated months before her final days. She wrote of betrayal, not of action, but of silence. She believed secrets were prisons and stated that truth should walk freely between two people who claimed devotion. Her sentences curled with fear, suspicion, and a question she never asked him aloud. He felt cold as he continued reading. She spoke of a promise he had made in the early days of their relationship. He had forgotten it in the noise of life, yet she had not. The next entry struck him like a blow. If he ever lies to me, I will not rest. I will come back to claim what was promised. The words did not sound emotional. They sounded resolute, like a verdict announced before the trial began. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, attempting to separate imagination from fact. He reopened the diary and read the next paragraph. She believed that every unspoken truth becomes a shadow, and shadows eventually find their way home. He felt something shift inside him, a realization that this situation was not born of grief. It was born of expectation. He reached the final entry. Her handwriting trembled, as though her hand was unsteady while writing. She described love as a pact sealed by honesty. She questioned whether he understood the weight of promises spoken casually, yet carried forever. The last line chilled him. Love ends only when truth does. He stared at the sentence, unable to move. It was not poetry. It was instruction. He closed the diary and pressed his fingers against the cover, sensing that the past had not returned without purpose. The events surrounding him were not random acts. They were responses. Her words felt like footsteps leading toward a destination he never agreed to visit. He now understood why the calls, the rose, and the messages had begun. She believed something had been left unfinished. He looked around the room, suddenly aware that nothing in the house belonged to chance. He had thought he entered a home. Instead, he had stepped into a promise awaiting completion. The diary was not a memory. It was a blueprint demanding action. Whatever bound her to him was not sentiment. It was obligation, and he realized with a sinking certainty that he stood at the threshold of something that would not release him until he delivered truth she believed she deserved. Night fell like a curtain pulled by an unseen hand. He sat on the edge of the living room sofa, the diary resting on the table, as if waiting for him to open it again. Clara lingered by the doorway, unable to decide whether she should stay or flee. The silence between them felt strained, filled with questions neither dared to ask. The house seemed to listen, walls tense, as though anticipating the moment something would break. He stared at the floor, unable to look at Clara, unable to deny the feeling that the house had shifted from structure to presence. The first sign came softly. The lights above them flickered once, then again, their glow trembling like candles in a storm. Clara glanced up and whispered his name in a voice that did not trust itself. He rose slowly, his movements careful, like someone walking on thin ice. The lights flickered faster, creating pulses that matched his heartbeat. The television turned on with a sharp crackle. A channel he did not select appeared, the screen filled with static that moved as if alive. He reached for the remote, but his hand stopped midway as the devices around the room began waking one by one. The radio on the shelf powered up. The sound system in the hallway surged. His phone vibrated. Clara's tablet lit up. The dishwasher hummed. The heater shut off. Every machine in the house came alive in a synchronized awakening, as though responding to a single command. Clara wrapped her arms around herself as the temperature fell. Frost crept across the living room window, forming patterns that resembled veins. He watched his breath rise like smoke, his pulse loud enough to swallow thought. Then came a voice, not from one device, but from all of them. Every speaker, every screen, every machine emitted the same sound. It was her, her tone layered upon itself, echoing through the house like 1,000 whispers packed into a single word. Tell the truth. The sentence repeated, growing louder, overlapping until the words became impossible to separate. Clara covered her ears, but the voice slipped through her fingers, invading the room without restraint. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. The doors slammed shut one by one. Each impact shook the walls. The lights surrendered and went black. The chorus continued in perfect rhythm, as though she was standing in every corner of the house at once. Shadows move across the walls, not flat silhouettes, but shapes with depth, bending and expanding like breath trapped in smoke. Clara stumbled backward, her eyes wide, her mouth open without sound. She pointed toward the staircase, struggling to form words. Something moved at the top of the stairs. Not a figure, but a presence that thickened the air. He turned. The darkness behind him tightened. The voice shifted in tone, no longer cold, no longer distant. It felt directed, personal. The words changed, spoken slower, clearer, as though standing inches from his ear. You promised. The sentence pierced him. He closed his eyes, convinced that opening them again would reveal her standing before him. Clara screamed. He spun around, searching for danger, yet the danger was not material. It was awareness. It was history refusing to remain buried. He felt warmth on his back. Not comforting warmth, but the sensation of breath. Someone stood behind him. He did not move. He cannot. The air pressed against his skin like fingers tracing guilt. He realized he was not facing a ghost created by memory. He was facing an accusation shaped like a person, an expectation with form, a vow demanding completion. The truth he had buried had found a voice, and its patience had run out. Clara grabbed his arm, begging him to leave the house. He did not answer. The voice wrapped around them, sealing the room with invisible weight. He understood now that silence was no longer protection. It was fuel. Whatever he had hidden had returned, clothed in echoes, carried by electricity, and determined to collect a debt. The house did not ask. It demanded, and the night allowed no escape. The house waited. The temperature had dropped so low that Clara's breath hovered in the air like a fog that refused to leave. He stood in the center of the living room, chest tight, mind racing, every instinct urging him to hold his silence. Yet silence had become a cage, and the voice that filled the house made the walls feel like they were listening. Clara pleaded with him, her voice trembling, asking what truth he was hiding. He did not answer her. He was answering something older, something that had followed him from grave. His knees weakened as the lights flickered once more. The air pressed against him like an invisible hand urging confession. He could no longer ignore what waited inside him. The truth was not violent. It did not involve infidelity or secret crimes. The truth was quieter and far more devastating. His late wife had asked him for something the night before she died. She had asked for reassurance. She needed comfort. She needed to know she remained the center of his heart, especially after a difficult argument that left doubt hanging between them. He remembered the way her voice cracked when she asked if he still believed in them. He hesitated that night. He did not reassure her. He told her he needed space. He walked away while she cried softly into her pillow, believing he would return once he calmed down. He never did. The next morning, she was gone. Not because of illness or violence. She left this world carrying a question she believed he refused to answer. The guilt had grown stronger than grief. He avoided her grave not because he feared death, but because he feared her eyes, whether imagined or remembered. The thought of standing before her tombstone with unspoken regret felt unbearable. He spoke none of this until now. His voice shook as he confessed that he had left her alone in her final night, not physically, but emotionally. He told Clara he could not face her grave because he believed his silence was the last thing she heard from him. The shame became a shadow he could not step around. He feared she died believing she was unloved. He feared his hesitation became her last memory of him. As he spoke, his voice broke in places he did not know could fracture. Clara stood still, unable to interrupt. The house seemed to lean closer with every word. He continued, explaining that he had bought flowers to visit her grave many times, only to turn away before reaching the gates. He avoided her family, convinced they could see what he felt. He told Clara that every year when her birthday arrived, he rehearsed apologies he never delivered. The secret grew inside him, shaping his steps, his choices, and even his relationships. He believed that moving forward required forgetting the truth. Instead, forgetting had turned his life into a corridor with no exit. When he finished speaking, the cold vanished. Not gradually, instantly. The windows cleared. The frost melted. The lights hummed softly, as if relieved. Yet the silence that followed did not bring comfort. It felt heavy, like a judgment rendered without words. Clara exhaled shakily, but he did not look at her. He could not. He felt as though the walls had eyes and the air had memory. The house was not listening anymore. It was weighing. He waited for something to move, something to break, something to speak again. Nothing did. The silence was not calm. It was a verdict. The house held the confession without reaction, leaving him unsure whether forgiveness existed in this realm. He wondered if truth gave rest to the dead, or if it simply awakened expectations he could never satisfy. Clara reached for him, but he flinched, uncertain if the room was empty or if something unseen still listened. The truth had been spoken, yet nothing felt resolved. He understood now that endings were not made of words alone. They required acceptance. and acceptance was something he had never learned to give. The silence watched him, waiting for what came next. Morning arrived without ceremony. The first rays of light crept across the living room floor, illuminating the remnants of a night that had broken reality. He woke on the sofa, unsure if sleep had claimed him or exhaustion had merely shut his eyes. The house felt still, not in peace, but in the aftermath of something that had taken what it came for. He reached for his phone, compelled by habit rather than reason. Her number, once an anchor of dread, no longer existed. A message on the screen confirmed it. The line had been disconnected. No trace, no redial option, no digital ghost left behind. The silence that followed was not absence. It was conclusion. He walked into the kitchen, where the white rose rested in a glass vase. The petals, once unblemished and alive with unnatural freshness, had wilted overnight. The stem bent under its own weight, as though surrendering. He touched the petals lightly. They crumbled in his fingers, turning into fragments that fluttered to the floor. The house, once filled with whispers and demands, now held nothing but the ordinary hum of appliances. Every sign of her presence dissolved, leaving no evidence except memory. The air no longer carried cold breath or shifting shadows. Yet something lingered, something quieter and heavier. Clara stood by the doorway, suitcase beside her. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had tried to battle something beyond reason. She spoke without anger, her tone closer to resignation. She told him she could not live in a house where the past behaved like a rival, where memories had voices and truth had consequences. She did not blame him. She blamed a story she could not enter, a story that began before she appeared. Her eyes shone with sadness rather than bitterness. She kissed him once, not as a farewell, but as acknowledgement of a chapter she knew could never belong to her. He did not ask her to stay. Words failed him, not from lack of care, but from the realization that he could not promise her freedom from something he still carried. She left quietly, closing the door behind her. The sound echoed through the empty hallway like the end of a prayer. He stood motionless for several minutes, listening for knocks that no longer came. When none arrived, he felt a hollowness settle inside him. The house was silent again, yet it remained attentive, like a room waiting for its occupant to speak first. Days turned into weeks. He resumed routines, yet nothing felt unchanged. He continued his work, greeted neighbors, and attended gatherings, but every action felt like a performance for an audience that no longer existed. People assumed his quiet demeanor was grief resurfaced. They had no idea grief was the least of what remained. The house became a boundary line between what could be forgotten and what must not. He cleaned the rooms, repaired the flickering lights, and even repainted walls, as if covering evidence of something he could never explain. He never remarried. The thought of beginning again felt like trespassing on a promise he had never resolved. He remained in the house, not because he loved its memories, but because leaving felt wrong. He could not step away from a place chosen long before he understood its purpose. He sat by the window, most evenings, watching the garden where petals once formed paths. Nothing moved there now, yet he always checked, as though expecting a sign. In quiet moments, he heard her final words echo inside him. They did not haunt. They instructed, "I will return when you forget the truth." He repeated them occasionally, not aloud, but in thought, ensuring the memory remained intact. The sentence carried weight, not as threat, but as condition. His life no longer followed seasons or calendars. It followed remembrance. Memory became his anchor, his boundary, and his punishment. Some people die once. Their absence lives in photographs and ceremonies. Others die repeatedly, inside the minds that refuse to release them. He understood now that saying nothing had been the most costly choice of his life. Silence had built a door that never closed. He stayed in the house because he feared the day memory softened, the day truth faded, the day her voice might need to return. He waits, not in devotion, but in obligation. The past has a pulse, and he has learned that certain stories do not end when breath ceases. They end only when truth is remembered without pain.